Pain doesn't just wound a person, it reshapes the very architecture of their mind. When you look at someone who seems to have lost control, someone who explodes with emotion or withdraws into chaos, you're not seeing craziness. You're seeing the echoes of a past that was too heavy for a young heart to carry. People break for reasons, and those reasons are rarely simple. For years, they may have endured pressure, silence, and emotional isolation. They may have carried burdens no child or young adult should ever have to carry. Trauma doesn't walk into someone's life politely. It storms in, rearranges everything, and leaves the person trying to rebuild themselves using pieces that no longer fit together. This is what people overlook. The mind adapts to survive, not to stay perfect. When someone endures constant fear, rejection, instability, or betrayal, their brain rewires itself to cope. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Overthinking becomes a shield. Emotional outbursts become expressions of accumulated pain that has no safe exit. The world calls it instability, but it's really the result of a mind stretched beyond its limits for far too long. No one goes through years of emotional warfare and comes out untouched. Their reactions aren't random. They're shaped by the storms they've survived. And often, the most painful part is that their suffering was invisible while it was happening. They cried behind closed doors. They hid their fear under forced smiles. They convinced themselves to keep going even when they were breaking internally. That kind of silent struggle doesn't disappear. It echoes. It bleeds into adulthood. It shapes decisions, relationships, and self-worth. The person standing in front of you today may look unpredictable, angry, or overwhelmed, but inside them is a long, brutal history that no one ever cared enough to ask about. What looks like madness is often a story of battles fought alone, a story of emotional wounds that were never allowed to heal. The mind can only take so much before it reaches a point where survival becomes louder than logic. So when someone goes crazy, it's not a failure of character, it's a manifestation of everything they've been carrying in silence. Their breakdown is not random, it's a response to years of being strong when they should have been protected, heard, and understood. Chaos in a person's behavior often comes from a childhood where emotions were never safe, never welcomed, or never understood. When someone grows up in an environment where expressing fear or sadness leads to punishment, mockery, or silence, they learn to bury their feelings deep within themselves. Over time, these buried emotions don't disappear, they ferment. They pressure the mind from the inside, shaping how the person reacts to the world. What looks like overreacting or acting crazy is often the resurfacing of years of unprocessed emotions finally demanding to be acknowledged. A person's present chaos is usually the echo of their past neglect. People who grew up in emotionally unstable environments learn to survive by anticipating danger. Maybe they lived with unpredictable parents, constant shouting, or silent tension that felt like walking on broken glass. Their nervous system became wired for alertness, always scanning for threats, even when none existed. This is why, as adults, they might explode at small issues, panic without reason, or spiral over something minor. Their body remembers the past more vividly than their mind wants to. Their reactions aren't rooted in the present moment, but in old wounds that were never allowed to heal. Another brutal truth is that many people who seem emotionally unstable were actually forced to mature too fast. They had to take care of themselves, or even others, long before they were ready. Childhood was replaced with responsibility, fear, or survival. That kind of premature adulthood builds a mind that is constantly overloaded and exhausted. And when the body and mind can no longer carry that weight, it manifests as breakdowns, emotional volatility, or mental exhaustion. The world sees the explosion, but never the years of silent pressure that caused it. People who appear crazy often carry a deep, raw loneliness. They learned early that they couldn't trust anyone to care about their feelings, so they became emotionally self-contained. But no human being is designed to hold everything alone. Eventually, the isolation becomes unbearable. Their emotional eruptions are their mind, screaming from years of being unheard. Their instability is not a flaw, it's the byproduct of surviving what most people can't even imagine. Behind every irrational reaction is a rational cause. Behind every emotional storm is a childhood spent suppressing pain. A person's volatility is not who they are, it's what they lived through. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it reveals the truth. No one goes crazy without a story, and that story almost always begins in the places where they were ignored, burdened, or emotionally abandoned. People who go crazy in adulthood often carry a lifetime of hidden wounds that were never treated, never acknowledged, and never soothed. One of the most brutal truths behind their instability is that they were never taught how to process emotions, only how to survive them. When a child grows up in a home where anger is explosive, love is inconsistent, or silence feels like punishment, they become experts at hiding their true feelings. They learn to numb themselves because feeling too much was dangerous. But emotional suppression is not healing, it is simply postponing the inevitable. And eventually, all those unresolved emotions demand release. What looks like a sudden breakdown is often the delayed impact of years of emotional starvation. This kind of emotional neglect disconnects a person from themselves. They grow up without learning the language of their own heart. They don't know why they feel overwhelmed, or anxious, or furious. They just know something inside them keeps rising like a tidal wave. And because they never received emotional guidance, they don't have the tools to calm that wave. They weren't taught how to self-soothe, how to communicate, or how to process difficult feelings. So when life becomes stressful, their reactions come from old wounds, not present reality. Their emotions erupt in raw, untamed forms because they were never shown what healthy expression looks like. Many of these individuals also learned to equate vulnerability with weakness. Growing up in environments where showing pain led to shame or ridicule, they learned to toughen up and pretend nothing hurt. But the subconscious remembers everything, and the more a person forces themselves to appear strong, the more their inner child cries for release. This internal conflict between the need to be strong and the craving to be understood creates emotional instability that others mistake as irrational behavior. But it is not irrational, it is unprocessed pain fighting for recognition. Their breakdowns often reveal a deeper truth: they never felt truly safe. Safety is not just physical, it is emotional. A child who grows up without emotional safety lives in a constant state of internal war. As adults, that war continues, manifesting through anxiety attacks, impulsive outbursts, or emotional numbness. What looks like craziness is actually the body's desperate attempt to heal after years of battle. The chaos you see in them now is the expression of everything they couldn't express back then. Their instability is not a character flaw, it is the aftershock of surviving a childhood where emotions were a threat. Love was unpredictable, and silence was louder than any scream. One of the most brutal forces shaping a person who eventually goes crazy is the deep and unresolved fear of abandonment. This fear is often planted early in childhood, long before the person even understands what abandonment truly means. It doesn't only come from being physically left alone, it comes from emotional inconsistency, from caregivers who were present in body but absent in spirit. A child who grows up never knowing when love will arrive or when it will suddenly disappear learns to live in a constant state of hypervigilance. Their nervous system becomes trained to anticipate loss, rejection, or disappointment. As they enter adulthood, this fear follows them everywhere, imprinted on their relationships, their self-worth, and their ability to trust others. When someone carries this wound, they often cling desperately to people who matter to them. They fear losing them, even when there is no real threat. The slightest shift in tone, the slightest delay in response, the smallest disagreement, these become triggers that activate old memories of being ignored or dismissed. They react with intensity not because they want to push others away, but because they are terrified of being left behind again. Their emotional reactions appear dramatic or irrational to outsiders, but internally, they are fighting a battle against a fear that was never theirs to begin with. It was taught to them by the instability of their upbringing. Ironically, the fear of abandonment often leads them to sabotage their own relationships. They crave closeness but fear the pain that closeness can bring. They want to be loved, but they doubt that love can ever be stable. They yearn for reassurance but feel ashamed for needing it. This internal contradiction creates emotional turbulence that can erupt in ways they cannot control. They become the person who pushes people away before they can leave. They become the person who withdraws emotionally the moment they feel too exposed. They become the person who wants connection but fears it so deeply that it becomes a source of torment. Over time, constantly living in this emotional seesaw erodes their mental stability. The fear becomes exhausting, overwhelming, and paralyzing. They start to feel as though every relationship is a test they are doomed to fail. Every misunderstanding feels like a threat. Every moment of distance feels like abandonment all over again. This emotional wear and tear can lead to breakdowns, outbursts, and self-destructive behavior, not because they are crazy, but because their nervous system has been fighting a war for far too long. Their reactions are not madness. They are echoes of a child who once reached out for love and found only uncertainty. Their instability is the shadow of abandonment, a wound that never healed, manifesting in a heart that still fears being left alone in the dark. Another brutal psychological force inside a person who eventually goes crazy is the quiet, unspoken guilt they carry, guilt for things that were never their fault. This guilt begins early, often planted by environments that lacked emotional safety. When a child grows up in chaos, they learn to take responsibility for things far beyond their control. If parents fought, they assumed it was because of them. If someone they loved walked away, they believed they weren't enough. If life felt unstable, they blamed themselves for not being stronger, smarter, or more obedient. This kind of guilt is corrosive, slowly convincing them that they are defective at their core. As they grow older, this internalized guilt becomes a pattern of self-blame. Whenever something goes wrong, no matter how small, they immediately assume it is their fault. A failed relationship, their fault. A misunderstanding at work, their fault. Someone else's bad mood, somehow still their fault. This constant self-accusation drains their confidence and erodes their sense of identity. Instead of seeing themselves as human beings who make mistakes, they see themselves as the mistake itself. This mindset creates a heavy emotional burden that they carry everywhere, even when no one else notices. Over time, this guilt shapes their behavior in subtle but powerful ways. They become overly apologetic, excessively accommodating, and painfully afraid of upsetting others. They try to fix everything, even things far outside their responsibility, desperately hoping that if they can keep the peace, they can finally feel worthy. But the tragedy is that they never feel satisfied. No matter how much they do, no matter how hard they try, the guilt whispers that it will never be enough. They live in a constant state of emotional debt, always repaying a price for wounds they never created. Eventually, this unresolved guilt can turn inward with full force. It becomes self-punishment, self-sabotage, and emotional collapse. They may push away opportunities because they feel undeserving. They may isolate themselves because they believe they are a burden. In extreme moments, the guilt becomes so overwhelming that it distorts their perception of reality. They begin to believe that everyone is judging them, blaming them, or waiting for them to fail. Their mind becomes a courtroom where they are always the accused, always on trial, always waiting for the verdict. This emotional torture doesn't make them crazy, it makes them wounded. Their instability is the result of carrying guilt that was never theirs to carry. Deep down, they are not broken. They are exhausted from trying to redeem themselves for a crime they never committed. In the end, the person who goes crazy is not a monster, not a failure, and not someone who simply lost control. They are the product of years of silent battles, buried trauma, and emotional wounds no one ever paused long enough to see. Their chaos is not random. It is the echo of every moment they were ignored, blamed, or forced to carry the weight of a world that never belonged to them. Their outbursts, their confusion, their emotional breakdowns, these are not signs of weakness, but signs of a heart that held on far longer than anyone should have to. Behind every extreme reaction is a story, pain that was swallowed, responsibilities they never asked for, and guilt that suffocated their sense of self. Their madness is simply the final eruption of a volcano that has been trembling for years. And when you understand their past, you realize something powerful. Their struggle is not insanity, it is survival. They are not broken, they are deeply, painfully human. The conclusion is simple but profound. No one collapses out of nowhere. No one loses themselves without a history behind it. Those who seem the wildest often lived the hardest lives. Those who appear the most unstable once had to be the strongest. And those who seem crazy are often the ones who needed compassion the most. Healing begins when the world finally stops judging and starts understanding.